Good morning from the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm Roland Green, director of the Stanford Humanities Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second event in our series 1891 Lectures in the Humanities. Among the several new series we launched in 2020, including one concerned with humanities scholarship and social justice, and another highlighting transformative research that will peak in influence over the next 10 years, this series, whose title acknowledges the year of the university's founding, is first and foremost for the Stanford community. Of course, everyone is welcome, as is always the case when we broadcast and record our events. But with the 1891 events, we are aiming to convene our humanities faculty and graduate students as we welcome new senior members of the faculty and explore their thought. When we launched this series in January of this year, with our first Spico Atto Quaison, none of us could have expected it to be the last occasion before the pandemic in which we could gather as a community of humanities scholars. Today's speaker, Professor Anna Bigelow, was scheduled to appear at the center this past May. We're grateful that she has agreed to give her presentation today in a virtual format. I'd like to mention that today's presentation is being recorded and will be available on our website in the coming days. And if you would like to submit a question to the speaker, please use the Q&A box in Zoom, and we will do our best to get to the question after the lecture. Let me now introduce today's speaker, Anna Bigelow, who joined the Stanford faculty in the 2019-20 academic year. She is a scholar of Islamic studies, associate professor in the Department of Religious Studies at Stanford. She received her MA from Columbia University and her PhD in religious studies from UC Santa Barbara, with a focus on Islam in South Asia. Professor Bigelow's current project is a comparative study of shared sacred sites in India and Turkey, exploring how everyday devotional life in shared spaces illuminates the shifting terrain of these ambivalently secular states. Another project traces the lives of devotional objects circulated by Muslims, Hindus, and others around a Sufi tomb shrine in India. She is editor and contributor to an edited volume on material objects in Islamic cultures called Islam Through Objects, to be published next year by Bloomsbury, and about which I think she's going to speak today. Professor Bigelow's earlier work, a book entitled Sharing the Sacred, Practicing Pluralism in Muslim North India from Oxford University Press, is a study of a Muslim majority community in Indian Punjab and the shared sacred and civic spaces in that community. Obviously, this event takes place later than we had hoped and expected, more than a full year after she came to the Stanford faculty. Nonetheless, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Anna Bigelow, who will speak on thinking with Islamic things. Anna, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it's really just a joy to be able to have this event in these circumstances. So I will start by sharing my screen, and hopefully we can proceed without any crazy challenges. Thank you so much. I'd first like to begin, of course, with the land acknowledgement that Stanford University is located on the traditional and unceded territories of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. And again, to reiterate my thanks to Roland Green at the Stanford Humanities Center and Eric Ortiz and the whole team who've been amazing getting this to put together. It's been a very strange year since I joined the faculty here last fall, as we all know. But one of the best parts has been learning about the excellent and interesting work being done by so many here in the humanities and starting to participate in scholarly networks across the college. I look forward to future opportunities to connect with one another virtually and in real life. And so the purpose of these 1891 lectures, as I understand it, is to introduce new senior faculty to the university community and to celebrate the diversity of research in the humanities here at Stanford. And so I hope many of you heard Atto Quaison's talk in praise of interdisciplinarity earlier this year. My own field, religious studies, is inherently interdisciplinary, and our department here works with philology, philosophy, history, ethnography, critical theory, among other approaches to the study of religion, all looking at how religion shapes those areas of study and shapes the worlds that we live in. My own research, as Roland mentioned, is primarily located around sacred spaces in which Muslims and non-Muslims interact, and this interest has led me to look at these encounters from multiple angles. What makes such sharing possible or inhibits it? What are the larger effects of on the communities in which these sites are located? How do such engagements reflect collective notions of the nation and who belongs in it? So more recently, my interests have turned to the material culture of interreligious spaces and how material objects circulating in and through shared spaces help us to understand the shifting assemblage of plural civic life. And this is an image of one of the sites that I've been working at in Bangalore in India. So in 2013, my colleague Kambiz Ghanea Basri at Reed College and I organized the first of 5 years of conference sessions on material Islam at the American Academy of Religion. And from those sessions, we are now in the process of co-editing a special issue of Yale's journal MAVCOR, the Material and Visual Cultures of Religion, that should also be coming out next year. I was also fortunate to host a workshop here last fall at the Abbasi Center that resulted in this forthcoming volume, about which I'll be speaking today. In widening the scope of material religion and Islamic studies, the goal of these initiatives is to refine our explicit and implicit theoretical models, to amplify less heard from voices, and open up what constitutes the study of the material world and how Islamic materialities might contribute to and benefit from these openings. So the question sticks with us. What makes an object Islamic? For Ibn Arabi, 13th century polymath and great thinker, who's also one of the most subtle, as well as idiosyncraters, thinkers of his own or any time, the first answer is that everything is Islamic, having been endowed by the creator God with an innate awareness of its divine createdness, or fitra. He writes in the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, is there an inanimate object, jamad, which does not possess rational speech, a plant which has not realized the magnification of its creator, an animal which does not attest through its state, or a human being not connected to his Lord? That would be impossible. From this perspective, the whole manifest universe is a sign or ayah of God's creative power, and all created things, the makhluk, sentient and insentient, exist in a state of praise and worship by their very nature. Ibn Arabi also suggests that objects possess a form of speech, drawing on the Quran for evidence of this. Hence, every possible thing in existence must glorify God with a tongue that is not understood and a dialect that not everyone comprehends. But the people of unveiling hear it, and the faithful accept it in faith and worship. For God says, there is nothing that does not glorify him in praise, but you do not understand their glorification. Surely he is clement, concealing. This highly suggestive passage indicates that all things possess forms of communication, but not all humans are adequately attuned to their frequencies. So though Ibn Arabi's is just one of many voices that make up Muslim engagements with the material world, some of his concepts and queries anticipated directions that the study of material religion is taking centuries later. And it is the diversity of engagements that I hope to elucidate by bringing together an amazing group of scholars working in different disciplines, regions, and time periods at different stages of their careers, etc. So each of the Islamic objects engaged in this collection offers its own theory of materiality in ways both specific to their Islamic contexts and general in terms of culturally embedded materialities. Each chapter, as you can see from the table of contents, takes an object's eye view, beginning from a thing, an item, an artifact, a material production or reproduction, as a point of entrance into a particular world of Islam. These object-oriented analyses then help us to recognize the complex webs of making, use, meaning, and value that intersect through certain things, places, and times. Embracing the power of the particular, each object shapes and is shaped by the world it inhabits on multiple levels, from the personal to the political, social to the spiritual, the commodified to the aestheticized. These Islamic objects are not necessarily, or ever only, materialized theologies. Rather, taken together, they demonstrate the various ways in which Islamic objects help us to understand material religion in general, and how Islamic knowledge systems help us understand the things that permeate and activate our worlds. By now, we've seen many studies that demonstrate that Islam's reputation for iconophobia and for a categorical antipathy to most forms of material mediation is overblown. but the stereotype remains firmly and dangerously embedded in the public consciousness. Indeed, recent events in France relating to extremists and the Charlie Hebdo cartoons are interpreted not through the idiosyncratic pathology of the attackers, but as emblematic of a collective iconophobia imputed to Islam itself. This presumed and universalized iconophobia, framed as evidence of the inability of Muslims to assimilate and by extension to civilize, then enables Islamophobia and all of its antecedent prejudices, discrimination, and violence. Understood in this context, projects like the edited volume, journal issue, and conference series that I've been helping to put forward are all part of an effort to reject obfuscatory stereotypes, to demand specificity, and to widen the field of Islamic things about which we can think deeply and intelligently. Then we will be better able to ask questions about the ways in which objects can be understood as Muslim or Islamic, and how particular orientations within Islam inhabit material cultures in specific ways. To this end, more work remains to be done to situate somatic and object-oriented approaches within Islamic studies. Part of the challenge is that the field of Islamic studies has tended to weigh textual studies, classical formations, normative traditions, and the Middle East more heavily in the balance of scholarship and attention, approaches that will ideally be complemented by expansion into the material cultures that permeate the full range of Muslim life. And while art and architectural historians in the field have long explored objects and spaces, they sometimes tend to involve more formal analysis and to privilege elite or monumental works and original usage or purpose, which leaves room for socially and politically embedded studies of Islamic objects of all varieties and provenance. And we see this opening up with the work of scholars like Finbar Berry Flood, Christian Gruber, and D. Fairchild Ruggles. Multi-sided interdisciplinarity is required to bring Islamic studies and the study of material culture into productive conversation. In this, I'm not at all calling for the rejection of texts and theologies as critical components in the study of Islamic materialities. Rather, we must observe how the production, circulation, and deployment of things produce complex assemblages that resist any simple equivalence between an Islamic concept or principle and its material manifestation. Islamic objects intersect religions, economies, environments, and politics shaped by multiple notions of theological authenticity. Thus, these objects are productive sites in many ways. For example, some reveal histories that slither through shifting cosmopolitan milieu, as in the case of Christian Gruber's study of the figure of the Masonic Muhammad that unfolds like a detective story as she traces a particular image that becomes associated with the prophet from Iran to France to Masonic usages and contexts and back again. And so this circulation of this image and these ideas defy our sense of the boundedness of either theology or Islamicness, and provide some exciting opportunities to think. Others work in this volume are working across religious boundaries, as I do myself, as vectors, with these objects working as vectors of distributive agency, providing healing and protection, as in Joyce Flukiger's study of amulets in India. Some mark belonging in particular communities or groups, such as the MGT uniform addressed by Kayla Wheeler, the Nation of Islam and 5%er Nation pins, lapel pins, studied by Michael Muhammad Knight, the Chishti Sufi cap discussed by Scott Kugel, and the Tijani prayer beads displayed or concealed in Usman Kobo's essay. And I'll return to these in some as we go. These circulations across sovereign and social boundaries, such as the Rasulid fish coins analyzed by Roxani Margariti, and you can see the fishes in the center of these coins from Yemen, is an excellent example of what Islamicist Niall Green calls, quote, leaks in the hull of historical models characterized by the drawing of impermeable cultural boundaries, end quote. Each of these things communicates identity within and between cultural networks, as well as produces disciplined subjects through the proper deployment and ideal comportment engendered by their material properties. All of these objects are more than direct expressions of theological principles, but none exist in worlds uninformed by multiple ways of imagining the relationship between the divine and material planes. The interplay of human perception and material properties is partly, though by no means exclusively, informed by religious norms and expectations, as expressed in many Islamic sources. In both the Quran and Hadith, the records of the Prophet Muhammad's speech and actions, the phenomenal world is often rendered as an arena for contemplation and as a proving ground in which human effort is exerted to respond properly to the revelation's ethical and spiritual guidance. The Quran's audience is repeatedly enjoined to observe the world around, its harmony, its order, its bounty and beauty, its wonders and familiarities, and to recognize therein evidence not only of God's existence, but of God's very nature. The unifying principle of Tawheed, or divine unity, is conceptualized as manifest through created phenomenal, material, and immaterial things. As participants in this creation, humans must endeavor to engage deeply and appropriately with the world, while maintaining an abiding awareness of its fleeting temporality. Though not all of creation is aesthetically or morally appealing, the Quran reminds humanity that beauty is not only part of the divine plan and evidence of divine sovereignty, but it also presents, at least in part, an opportunity for moral self-cultivation. The Quran says, "Behold, we have willed that all adornments, zinat, on earth be a means by which we put men to a test, showing which of them are best in conduct, and verily, in time, we shall reduce all that is on it to barren dust." So how one responds to appealing things and environments is an opportunity to practice good conduct and beautiful behavior, adab, and to manifest one's perception and insight through proper responses to the material world. Though beauty may be ephemeral, in a frequently cited hadith from the Sahih Muslim, a canonical Sunni collection, the Prophet is reported to say, quote, "God is beautiful, Jamil, and loves beauty, al-Jamal." Arrogance means ridiculing and rejecting the truth and despising people, end quote. In context, the statement is a subtle teaching on the difference between arrogance and worldliness and the legitimate appreciation of beauty as a divine attribute and part of divine creation. The notion of human interactions with the material world as a proving grounds for morality, ethics, and upright living is also sustained in Islamic cultures in which the most authoritative discourses are not, or not only, the Quran and Hadith. The written and oral teachings of charismatic leaders and exemplars populate every place and time in which Islam has found a home. For example, one of the defining characteristics of the US-based Nation of Islam movement is an emphasis on proper bodily comportment as spiritual and material entrainment. In both Michael Muhammad Knight and Kayla Renee Wheeler's contributions to the volume, we see outward signs of belonging, lapel pins in one case and a uniform of clothing in another, as both markers and makers of ideal conduct and self-discipline, even as these teachings are in constant negotiation in the practice of the members. This is made clear in the words of Elijah Muhammad, the Nation of Islam founder, as quoted by Wheeler, wherein he enjoys cleanliness, minimalism, and self-respect as part of becoming, quote, fit members of any decent society of nations. And so the women who designed, made, wore, and modified the uniform in Wheeler's study, as well as the Nation of Islam and 5% wearers of the universal flag pin in Knights, are all engaged with the interpretive tradition of their communities through sartorial and adornment practices. The cap that denotes discipleship in Kugel's discussion of the symbolic, historic, and personal significance of the Chishti custom of investiture is also primarily activated by the relationship of a Sufi master and a murid, a seeker student. Produced, shaped, and worn by generations of Chishti disciples, the cap marks belonging and striving through an affective connection to the teacher and the tradition. The cap's beauty lies not merely in its aesthetic properties, but also in its metonymic qualities associated with the master. In his chapter, Richard McGregor highlights the iterative power of repetition and reproduction in his chapter on tracings of Muhammad's sandal, demonstrating that piety and efficacy operate through multiple registers, offering the faithful ways of connecting intimately with the Prophet's body through the imprint of his feet. In these examples, material culture works as mediations through which divine unity, Tawheed, is made perceivable to human imaginal faculties. As Islamic studies scholar Oludamini Ogunayake puts it, It is through imagination, or khayal, that the Islamic arts render the invisible divine visible. And it is through imagination that we can perceive the mysteries of a transcendent divine unity immanent in these sensory forms. So here, Ogunaike evokes one of the most productive tensions in Islamic theology, that between immanence, tashbih, and transcendence, or tanzih. And as he suggests, human imagination can be cultivated to perceive the transcendent through the immanent. In this view, the arts fulfill a mediational role between immanence and transcendence, between this world, the dunya, and the ultimate reality, the deen or haqiqa, reality. Rather than incommensurable poles, these modalities interpenetrate and interdepend, providing humanity with guidance. Islamic objects in this frame are translations, giving form to the formless, giving expression to hidden truths. In a distinct way, this is also the case with the Bektashi lamps illuminated by Mark Swallow in his chapter. Though these lamps are not exemplars of high art or intricate craft, the lamp is a dense coalescence of Bektashi teaching, ritual practice, and Mark's time, ritual time and space. Innumerable and indistinguishable in their form, they are materially essential for Bektashi spiritual gathering, making God, the master, and the disciples conceptually and physically present in and through their revealing light. And we see how in this invocation to the Bektashi prayer, the idea that the lamp itself and the illumination of that lamp resonates as a cognitive concept, the illumination of the mind and the spirit of the disciple, as well as the literal light that is being shed. So it's not only beauty or artistry then that defines religious objects. In his study of Islamic art and aesthetics, Aisha's cushion, Jamal Elias asserts that, quote, the religious image's primary place is not one defined by beauty or an aesthetic admiration for the skill of the creator, but by its efficacy as a representation, which is to say the effectiveness with which it allows the observer to access what is perceived through the image. In pushing the field beyond stale tropes of Islamic iconophobia, Elias argues that studying the implicative techniques of Islamic arts, such as ritual, performance, and commerce, allows us to see the interplay of bodies and material objects as both commodities and as transmitters of spiritual value and power. In expanding from, though not abandoning, aesthetics and questions of beauty, a much wider material world opens up, enabling multiple relational frames. And this helps us to go beyond the aesthetic, the transactional, and the commodified to include wider sensory repertoires involved in the productive, consumptive, and performative aspects of Islamic things embedded in their cultures and histories. And so this enables closer observation of the ways in which embodied material practices are indices of object efficacy and are productive of certain dispositions and sentiments. This is evident, for example, in Flukiger's study of the amulets written by a Muslim woman healer for her multi-religious clientele, wherein their value is predicated not on discursive comprehension, but proper execution and her authority, thereby shaping fields of ethical action that are populated by things. In the late Shahab Ahmed's tome, What is Islam? The Importance of Being Islamic, which is a work that above all argues for a capacious, exploratory, what he calls coherently contradictory definition of Islam over and against legalist, textualist, and prescriptive models. In this work, Ahmed addresses material and artistic formations, mostly in terms of arts, crafts, garments, and especially poetry produced by and for elite patrons. Through these examples, he asserts that the objects of everyday life are objects to which the user stands in a relationship of quotidian intimacy. And so for Ahmed, the very everydayness of meaningful objects also speaks to a transcendence made available through the object's role in producing an art of consciousness that witnesses to higher values. By extension, we could suggest that non-elite, ephemeral, and mass-produced objects are also participants in an art of consciousness, whose, quote, daily use is the altering and orienting of consciousness towards an ongoing state of the meaningfulness of everyday life as a hermeneutical engagement with revelation as pretext, text, and context. And Ahmed is certainly not shy about using complex phrasings, but essentially we can take from this the idea that all of one's comportment and behavior in relation to objects is a kind of interpretive engagement. It is ways of theorizing as humans what these objects mean and are, and how we orient ourselves to and through them. So the alterations and orientations engendered by objects and bodies can be understood as having hermeneutical capacities, not merely as expressions of belief, but also as orienting agents in the creative process of Muslim becoming. This is particularly important if one insists that the arts of consciousness are engaged by all Muslims in diverse ways, regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, ability, sexuality, class, language, or age. Theorizing, then, what Islam is does not belong only to the text-producing and legal-minded elite. On the contrary, the selection of a garment or adornment, the consideration of an image or an object, the adaptation to built and natural environments, and the manipulation of materials of devotion or daily need offer theories and interpretations of Islam as well. So these objects activate notions of appropriate practice, enculturated norms, personal choices, markers of identity, and internalized values. For example, in the case of Baki, the protagonist of Omar Boom's chapter on the wooden tablets used for Quranic learning, the tablet became an extension of his own body as he interacted with it. This illustrates the capacity of material objects both to mark and produce a fundamental identity shift. Baki's status as a former slave would typically have excluded him from such training, but by learning how to prepare and care for, use and preserve the tablet, he was himself transformed in his own eyes and in that of his community. In this frame, Islamic things can be understood as vectors through which the arts of consciousness that Ahmed laid out are unfolding. And it's also important at this point to recognize the erasures that occur when only certain forms of materiality are regarded as having aesthetic or social value, or as being truly Islamic. As Omar Kasmani points out in his work, Muslim Matter, quote, "This work on visualities and materialities is being imagined in a climate where what is framed as Muslim is often pronouncedly pious, overwhelmingly masculine, if not simply aggressive or traditional. And to that list," end quote, and to that list we might add assumptions of Arab heteronormativity and a legacy of Orientalist and colonial determinations concerning the legitimate fields of inquiry into Islam. Kasmani's edited volume, Muslim Matter, is an effort to reflect, if not represent, and this is a quote, "the complexity of lived experiences in dialogue, places where prayer goes hand in hand with ideas of amusement, and where simple pleasures offset the harshness of conflict-ridden environments, or persons that straddle social expectations amid non-normatively lived genders and sexualities. Also communities which are in conversation with non-Muslim majorities, and occasions where the humanness of the subject takes precedence over its Muslimness," end quote. So framed in this way, the study of Muslim material culture is a profoundly humanistic enterprise that is engaging a critical mode of politics. Expanding the field of what constitutes Islamic material culture is also a central purpose of the projects that I've been contributing to, as they consider objects that are beautiful as well as those are unremarkable, functional as well as decorative. What makes these objects Islamic is partly their embeddedness in particular Islamic cultures and the conceptual affordances they provide as ways of grasping complex epistemic webs. And this reminds us that the interpretive possibilities available to a given person or community with regards to the objects within its orbit are neither accidental nor absent of politics. As Christy Gruber and Sunay Hogbole express it in their introduction to their 2013 volume, Visual Culture in the Modern Middle East, quote, "Forms of viewing become constitutive for subjectivities and social structures. At the same time, and perhaps in a self-fulfilling prophecy, visual representations create and reinforce those same systems," end quote. So the imbrication of objects and their contexts points to the possibility that objects are not merely passive recipients of a subject's interpretive abilities and limitations. And this represents a shift in the field of material religion. Whereas Colleen McDaniel had argued in her foundational 1995 work, Material Christianity, that, quote, "material culture in itself has no intrinsic meaning of its own. Objects or landscapes are understood and gain significance when their human elements can be deciphered. End quote. We now see a clear shift to account for the power of things themselves. Certainly, material objects help us to grasp that a great deal of human labor and non-human labor goes into navigating the multiple authorizing regimes. They're the product of work, naturally occurring, or of human manufacture. Things are embedded in local economies and politics and authority structures, but these objects can also be understood to possess what Jane Bennett calls thing power. Thing power, in Bennett's terms, is, quote, the curious ability of inanimate things to animate, to act, to produce effects, dramatic and subtle, end quote. And so whether naturally occurring or manufactured through various agencies, things produce observable effects and affects as they resonate beyond their physical limits and elicit or inhibit feelings, concepts, changes, and affirmations. Material objects are also made up of elements belonging to multiple orders, such as the inorganic and organic, biological and mechanical assemblages. Seeing things in relation to people, rather than solely as inanimate objects of human subjects, suggests that the study of things is not dissimilar to the study of human individuals or social structures. And so we see this in the 14th century Gurnot and Well, Algibé de Larrey, explored by D. Fairchild Ruggles in her chapter, is precisely such a relational enterprise. In her study, the human and non-human, natural and manufactured, fluid and fixed assemblage of the well intersects with its builders, benefactors, and beneficiaries in ways that both manifest and maintain social hierarchies. Here we see on the right the traces of household human labor, likely of women or slaves, producing grooves for the acquisition of a naturally occurring liquid. It's been brought to the well by a system of aquifers and aqueducts, built by untold numbers of workers in service to a sovereign whose beneficence is materialized in the provision of the water. For Jane Bennett, understanding things as partaking of thing power means to understand them as vital matter. The implications of vital matter are significant for this historic epoch, often called the Anthropocene, defined by Anna Gade as, quote, the geological era in which humanity indelibly alters the planetary record, end quote. Bennett sees vital matter as a critical intervention in a world where the existence of all things is being troubled, in no small part due to the environmental degradation driven by the imperatives of late-stage neoliberal capitalism. In her assessment, vital materialists will thus try to linger in those moments during which they find themselves fascinated by objects, taking them as clues to the material vitality that they share with them. This sense of a strange and incomplete commonality with the outside may induce vital materialists to treat non-humans, animals, plants, earth, even artifacts and commodities more carefully, more strategically, more ecologically. And so the permeability of things and the permeability of bodies opens both up to a recognition that human existence is infused with non-human things and vice versa. Humans and things are assemblages comprised of physical matter, sensory experiences, and spiritual sensibilities, situated within sympathetic alliances of political, economic, and social structures. This intertwined existence emerges profoundly in Gade's chapter, which considers Mecca's Zemzem water, a spring with a prophetic origin story emerging from beneath the heel of the prophet Ismail, when as a child he kicked the earth as his mother Hagar searched for life-giving water. The water from this aquifer today exemplifies a convergence of water management and purification technologies, changing local and global environmental conditions, the pilgrimage industry in Saudi Arabia, and constant demands as a faithful public seeks its spiritual blessings. This convergence evokes Bennett's suggestion that if humans recognize their shared material vitality with all that is, the resulting sense of sympathetic alliance with animate and inanimate things could have transformational potential. And so perhaps more pertinently, it brings us back to Ibn Arabi's insights into the nature of things in this world, that humanity must recognize the reality, truth, rightness, and properness of things, and on the basis of this recognition, to give them their haqq, that is, what is appropriate for them and rightfully due to them. For Ibn Arabi, who's here drawing on a prophetic hadith to this effect, all things, sentient and insentient, have haqq, have something that is rightfully due to them. and it is the ethical duty of humanity to honor this and to act accordingly. This is also taken up in some Sufi contexts in which things generally perceived as inanimate are, to quote one Sufi teacher, are actually alive because everything carries a spirit, everything provides a service. It is a debt for the served to reward and respect those who serve, end quote. And so Sufi dervishes will only step gently on the ground when they walk and kiss the glass spoon and table that facilitated their nourishment. Respect and reverence should characterize every interaction with everything, whether perceivably sentient or not. So this line of inquiry suggests that to grasp the many possibilities facilitated by Islamic things requires attention not just to theologies and demographics, economics, and social networks that are productive of them, but also to the possibilities engendered by the mediation of power that is both extrinsic and intrinsic to them. As W.J.T. Mitchell points out, quote, we need to show how things that people make people, end quote. This observation picks up from Mitchell's compelling question, quote, what do pictures want, end quote, a question that resonates with the Quran's query, am I not your Lord, in the 7th chapter, verse 172, which Islamicist Karl Ernst characterizes as the fundamental articulation of Islamic ethical being. In both of these interrogations, humans are required to conceive of themselves as part of a web of existence, and not as the only or even the most important strand of that web. In the post-human Anthropocene, this dislocation is a critical intervention and gives to each that has a haqq its haqq. Gade builds on this idea in her discussion of Zemzem water as productive material through which to decolonize the study of material religion and the environmental humanities by recognizing that how we imagine or understand things, such as water, may alter the real horizons of ontology, extraction, and transaction, end quote. Another consideration is offered by scholars advocating attention to a more robust religious sensorium in which material culture plays an essential role. David Morgan, for example, points out that materiality occasions, quote, the infinitely varied means by which human beings feel their way into their worlds, feel themselves, feel the past, anticipate the future, feel together, end quote. Here feelings are attuned not just to other humans or to doctrines and belief, but to a more capacious world of things, both animate and inanimate. It also suggests the possibility of an improvisational or speculative mode of sensation. Yet, importantly, Morgan also lets us know that societies invest a great deal in promoting shared feeling amongst their members and alerts us to the prominent role of material objects in producing kindred sensibilities. We can only look to our own political situation and how ideas around certain monuments or flags become emblematic of a collective social effort to elicit a shared response from their deployment. The senses are not outside the realm of biopower or thing power and operate with shifting constraints and freedoms afforded and conditioned by their contexts. Indeed, one of the challenges to understanding objects embedded in religious worlds is the interplay between individual sensibilities and their entraining system or systems in which they are located. So Charles Hirschkind, an anthropologist of Islam, studies this as the production of an ethically responsive sensorium in the context of normative models of moral personhood that are presented in part through particular material formations. Hirschkind's interlocutors strove to respond appropriately, and appropriateness here is a vector of power, to the stimulation of the self by listening to recorded sermons. This view of the self as an assemblage, acting within and acted upon by the material and imaginal worlds it encounters, suggests the ways in which material objects are both made by and make the human subject. And so while Hirschkind explores this process in relation to what he termed the Islamic revival in late 20th century Egypt, a similar dynamic is observable in my own research fields among Muslims engaged with the popular shrine-based cultures of Islam. And these images are from my work in Bangalore. The cultivation of moral personhood that takes place in shrines is embodied, it's extremely physical, it's materialized, and there's countless kinds of objects that circulate here. It's disciplinary. There's right and wrong ways that one is encouraged to deploy these objects, and which the objects themselves necessitate in your interactions with them. And they're also sometimes improvisational. Not everybody knows what to do and may be moved to do particular things from their own volition. But each shrine has its own etiquettes, its authorities, and constituencies. And so what is offered, taken, purchased, distributed, or ingested is sometimes determined by the authoritative regimes of the sites, sometimes responsive to exigency, and is sometimes the result of individual proclivities. The various purposes conceived and enacted by participants are understood by some to be achievable only if the proper things, behaviors, and attitudes cohere. For others, the efficacy of a ritual is contingent primarily upon correct execution, and not on intention, preparation, or self-discipline, or even comprehension. So whether for the benefit of self or others, these engagements at shrines produce a moral assemblage. Attention to the material culture of a religious context allows what Morgan calls the, quote, felt life of belief to emerge from the sometimes abstract debates over doctrine that often overshadow the pragmatics of everyday and embodied religion. The ability of persons and things to mediate divine power or to facilitate intercessory benefits is a richly debated subject in Islamic legal and theological traditions. The hermeneutic potential of mediational practices is key to understanding those debates. For the denizens of the shrines that I study, things, grave coverings, flowers, scents, food, amulets, strings, ashes, padlocks, money are essential and ubiquitous. They generate blessings in the form of barakah, or this blessing power, spiritual power. They offer healing. They transmit the barakah. They circulate and comfort and elicit various affective responses. For some, their existence is so quotidian as to be unremarkable. Others, particularly those aware of the theological or political critiques, are invested in defensive polemics using textual and or experiential evidence of the legitimacy and efficacy of these objects and their devotions. So the acceptability of things, certain kinds of things or things in general, is contested among various schools of Islamic thought. An amulet that one Muslim treasures as a connection to a spiritual guide or activator of a fervently held prayer may be regarded by another as innovative and idolatrous. And these are all objects that offer one houses, jobs, health, good luck in school, and many other kinds of benefits. But even prayer beads that may seem so ubiquitous as to be unquestioned in most cultures, Muslim or not, are for some schools of thought both innovative, bid'ah, and smacking of idolatry or shirk. This is a point raised by Usman Kobo in this volume in his chapter, which describes debates in Burkina Faso between proponents of tasbih, or prayer beads, and those so critical of their use that they would toss them out of mosques with their toes. Though rejecting their use, such gestures clearly also point to the potency of the tasbih to either corrupt or enhance one's prayers. Kobo further demonstrates how the tasbih both represent the bearer's identity, in some cases whether it's worn visibly or concealed, and help to shape it through cultivated practice, even to mark the individual as rebellious or obedient colonial subjects. In the prayer beads on the left, there's one additional bead that marked people out as being pro or anti-French colonial government. And so the French could actually ask to see the prayer beads to determine the identity of the carrier. And so in this sense, we're in considering whether objects are Islamically acceptable or not, Leor Halevi's recent work has attuned us to how the Salafis that he studies extricate things from religion using their preferred tools of law and theology. Halevi points out that the particular assemblages of material culture are deliberately formed, carefully selected, and vigilantly policed. In his 2019 book, Modern Things on Trial, Halevi examines how inventions were deemed halal or haram, or in between, during the period of the great reformist thinker, Rashid Ridda. His study demonstrates the productive power of things, toilet paper, gramophones, telegraphs, paper money, to demand legalistic, textualist, and disciplinary labor from the world they come to define. So ultimately, the various projects I am outlining here are not trying to force a single approach to what Islamic objects are and what we can learn from them. But this work does make it clear that somatic and object-oriented aspects of the culture of Islamic things are as significant in understanding the formations of Islam as our doctrines, texts, and ethics that also intersect in the production and interpretation of those things. The everydayness and habitual quality of the objects I and my colleagues are engaging make them ideal vantage points from which to observe the production of ethical ideals through interpretive engagements comprehended through bodies and objects. Individually, each object tells a story in which it animates and illuminates a particular Islamic world. And collectively, they complicate perceptions of Islam as a monolithic and iconophobic religion and offer new ways forward in the study of material religion and Islam. So I will wrap up there and stop the screen share. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. That is not only a kind of densely packed introduction to the things that you've been working on lately, but it's really amounts to a kind of cross-section of a big part of your field. And so I want to start by asking you a question about the trajectory of your own thinking over the last decade or so, with this involving your earlier work, your work in progress, and then the collective project you described here today. So as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm getting the trajectory of your work wrong, your first monographic project is about sort of shared religious and civic space in a Muslim majority part of India. The monographic project that's currently underway is about shared spaces in India and Turkey. And then in between is the project from which we saw so many beautiful images, striking images today, the sort of collective editorial project on Islam and objects. How has this sort of moment in between of working on objects influenced the way that you think about spaces and shared spaces? How do these episodes of your work come together in your thinking?
Thank you so much. That's a great way to sort of explain what might at first seem like sudden shifts in my research trajectory. My first entry point into the town that I did my dissertation research on and that became the first book was through the Sufi shrine that's at the center of the town. And so every day at the space, people of all religions would come through and they would engage in both very stylized formal kinds of rituals and prayers, as well as very mundane human interactions and conversations. And so from my perspective, one of the things that I became immediately interested in was, how do we understand the different perspectives on these practices that are informed by different religious perspectives, that are informed by different histories and families and social locations and genders and et cetera. And so the fact that there is no shrine anywhere in the world that I visited that is not also replete with materialized and embodied formations of devotion meant that everywhere that I have gone, I've accrued a kind of extraordinary collection of ephemeral and as well as more substantial objects that circulate through these spaces. In the first project, one of the things I became interested in, and in the other book that I'm working on now, I'm interested in the ways in which these are parts of imagining collective belonging and producing an ethos of collective existence. In the town of Malerkotla in Punjab, this ethos was produced through these shared practices and narratives and stories that are reiterated and reactivated and constantly being fed and cared for. In India and Turkey today, what we see in shared spaces are real tensions around who gets to be a member of this society now, as the secular states in both countries are reformulating themselves in substantial ways. And where, particularly in India, being Muslim is not always a safe or comfortable thing, and is often being rendered as somebody who does not belong, who should not be a participant in this society. And so within those dynamics, there is also this very everyday process of people coming to spaces in order to fulfill their immediate and visceral needs, and who regard people of other religions as being elemental in facilitating that. And the objects produced within those other religious contexts are also circulated, some of which harmonize with one another. You know, flowers are given at a Sufi tomb as they would be at a Hindu temple. Many types of food would also be offered, incense, etc. These are shared in common. But then there are also objects that are particular to particular spaces and practices and interactions that are distinctive. And so, in a way, looking at the objects is a way of shortcutting the filtering that humans do when we explain what we're doing. And you can actually watch objects move in and through spaces and then back out into the worlds in which their users are deploying them. And so looking at the objects was sort of another entryway into what's happening within these dynamics. What is shared? What are these objects doing? How do these objects distribute what Bennett and Flukiger in her essay both called distributive agency? Like, how is that moving out into worlds beyond? And does that have any effect on what it means to be a participant in a shared religious world, as well as within those particular spaces? So how does what's happening within these spaces shape and affect and permeate other worlds beyond? I don't know if that completely answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does. It does. And it gives me some ideas about how, certain new perspectives have sort of energized your thinking between the first project and the one that you're currently working on, that there's a kind of burst of different ways of thinking about objects and what we might do with them. The other question I wanted to ask, a kind of big methodological question before we get into some more specific questions that members of the audience have for you. The second question is this. If I followed correctly, early on in the talk, you said something about that you were trying to, again, correct me if I'm wrong, trying to sketch out a kind of productive space between, on the one hand, the kind of object study that you associated with a textually focused traditional Islamic studies, in which objects are, I think you say accessories of texts or something like that. They're textually connected in some way, and on the other hand, the kind of work done by art and architectural historians who emphasize monumentality and the cultural, for lack of a better term, maybe the cultural capital and the cultural importance of their objects. What that leads me to wonder is can you say a little bit more about the contours of that kind of space you're trying to describe in between those approaches? That is to say, the kind of objects that interest you and your collaborators in this editorial project, do they have a relation to textuality that is different from that of what the traditionalists in this field might have emphasized? And what have you learned from art and architectural historians on their side in terms of the way they treat their art, their objects?
Yeah, thank you. That's a terrific question. And so I'm certainly not ever arguing that texts and the kinds of concepts that are informed by textual formations are not also informing objects themselves and the way they work. What we are trying to trouble, and I'm not, of course, the only person working in this field at all, but what I think a lot of us are trying to trouble the idea that there's a sort of direct line between a theological expression that we would find in, say, the Quran or Hadith and its material manifestation, and that there's this kind of direct channel or conduit between these things. The other thing that I think that we're trying to open up rather than counter exactly, is to say that, certainly the texts and theologies and, the Middle East and the 7th century are all incredibly important in shaping what Islam is today. But there's also a lot more to it than that. There are particularly those cultures which are based around charismatic leaders that may be regarded as heterodox by large portions of the Muslim population, that are populated particularly by women, by people not regarded as being amongst the scholarly elite, non-literate people. All of these are actually, there's an incredible sophistication and subtlety to the ways in which all of these people are also theorizing what it means to be Muslim, and that objects are one of the ways in which they do that. And I think, so, I mean, I go back to Omar Boum's chapter on a former slave who, in a sense, himself, through the process of engaging with the wooden board on which he learns to write and to practice the Quran, that it requires treatment. It has to be cared for. It has to be prepared in certain ways. And that part of that entrainment is part of the process of becoming who he was. And it's a theory of what is the effect of knowledge, what is the effect of appropriate behavior in relation to a material object. The Rudolf Ware's amazing book, The Walking Quran, also discusses the ways in which these very embodied practices of becoming the Quran are not simply about the discursive, rational properties of the Quran, but about the ways in which it is actually lived through physical and material experiences. And so I think that's really something that some of the most exciting work is being done. And of course, into this, art and architectural historians have been contributing enormously for years, and some of the best foundational figures in the field, people like Oleg Grabar and others, have offered us a huge specificity of vocabulary, a particularity, and attention to detail that I think is in other humanities is not always part of our repertoire. And so it's really kind of humbling and awe-inspiring to hear people like Finbar Barry Flood or Christian Gruber or Didi Ruggles speaking about the importance of these specificities, but also placing them within these broader social contexts. And so, I think those are really inspiring and helpful for people like me who didn't train as an art historian, but has been more of a ethnographer, anthropologist, kind of religious studies person. And so these are all, I think it's sort of yes and rather than no, stop that kind of approach.
Yes, and presumably the pendulum swings back again. I mean, the kind of insights that you and your collaborators are nurturing at this moment presumably can be absorbed back into art and architectural history and back into the broader field of Islamic studies. So one imagines that there will be an interchange here, ideally. Yeah. Before I ask a couple more specific questions, let me pose a couple of general questions that come from the audience. And I'm going to take the liberty here of putting together two different people's questions at the risk of perhaps asking you something that's so big that it's unanswerable. For some reason, I feel like I want to put these two questions together. The first one is, and I'm now quoting someone, "This is a fascinating talk. Given all you've told us about material cultural values in Islam, my question is whether there's less of a tradition in Islam of rejecting physicality of objects and human bodies than there is in others of the world's great religions." That's the first one. Second one is related, I think. It is, can you discuss how different sects within Islam value matter differently?
Okay, so those are both fantastic questions. So it's difficult to paint with a very broad brush to answer the first question, because as the second question points out, there are very different approaches within different Islamic communities, both geographically, regionally, as well as historically and temporally. And so I can talk a little bit about that. I can say that certainly to an extent that the nature of the body I think it's exaggerated how much it's been rejected in other religions, particularly when you consider that, say, in some of the most stereotypically austere and ascetic traditions within Christianity, for example, there's still an obsession with the body, and the body is very central. So the work of people like Carolyn Walker Bynum is fantastic in pointing out the ways in which even traditions that might be perceived as being engaged with bodily denial and self-discipline are actually also, because of their very nature, are very deeply embedded in bodily conceptions. So within Islam, probably the biggest tension in relation to objects is in relation to the question of whether objects and their powers are perceived as amounting to a form of idolatry. And so where the line on idolatry or shirk gets drawn varies quite widely within different communities and regions. And so for some, the deployment of objects to contact, for example, your prayer beads to the tomb of a revered teacher is seen as a way of bringing some of that barakah, that blessed spiritual power and blessing, into oneself, into contact with oneself. For others, that idea that power is transmissible through an object is a slippery slope, essentially, from there to the idea that those prayer beads now have power themselves to affect spiritual transformation, or healing, some miracle, etc. And so for those Muslims who are critical of the use of particular kinds of objects, that's where the crux of the debate really lies. Are these things amounting to a kind of idolatry? And so this is where Leah Halevi's work is so helpful, in that he's looking at the very specific ways in which the Salafi Muslims that he's studying, a particularly traditionalist approach that regards the model of the first generations of Muslims as not just being admirable and pious, as most Muslims would, but rather as being essential and necessary to adhere to as closely as possible. For them, the sense that any power imputed to these objects is, in a sense, a diminishment of God's sovereign authority, and needs to be closely policed and marked, and vigilantly observed. In terms of the body in general, Islam is certainly, the creation of the human body is as in many religions, seen as a divine plan. This was not accidental, that humans have the capacity to enjoy and dislike, to smell beautiful things and putrid things, to experience physical pleasures and pain. That is part of, there's reasons for all of those things. And so they all are part of who we are and form necessary functions for us. So for the first question, how does this compare to other religions? That certainly gets fleshed out. It doesn't always mean that Muslims are more or less, open to particular types of bodily practices than others. And there's a lot of criticism. There's criticism for some Muslims. Fasting during the Shi'i period of Muharram, the first 10 days of the month of Muharram, is seen. There are periods of time when fasting is done by some sects and not by others. And so you can see debates around bodily practices as being appropriate or inappropriate at different points in time. Does that kind of gloss around there?
No, that's great. In fact, that works so well, I'm going to put together 2 more questions. How's this? Both happen to be from Stanford colleagues of ours. The first one, Sherry Turkle talks about objects as thought companions and as life companions. Given the ephemerality of many of the quotidian objects that you've talked about, can you comment on something like durability or processuality of these objects made sacred? And then the second question, as you will see, related, can you speak to the loss of materiality in Islam in the age of prayer apps, digital scriptures, and virtual pilgrimage?
Well, yeah, those are really interesting and fascinating connections to make. So the idea of durability, and the sense that these objects can be life companions, though many objects are quotidian and ephemeral in the sense that they may not be substantively made, they may be in fact be meant to be disposed at some point, to thrown in a body of water or buried in a certain location, or simply they would disintegrate if they're of fruits and flowers and things like this. So that ephemerality, of course, the particular object takes place in an ephemeral context, but the broader practices endure, and so they create a sense of continuity, a sense of perdurance, if you will. And I guess to pick up on the questioner's evocation of Turkle, the sort of processuality, that this is something that is ongoing and unfolding, that these are not practices which have beginnings and ends in any clear and defined way, and that may transform and shift slightly in their meanings and sensibilities for their audiences and those who engage them over time. So particular rituals or events can take on new meanings at different historic moments as they become symbolic of particular imaginings or articulations of what it means to be a member of this community at a particular point in time, and they can be interpreted in a whole host of ways in relation to the needs of the moment. So I'd say there's both continuities that may or may not endure within a particular physical object, but that persist through practice and engagement over time. And it's interesting then, and to look at the archaeological record, which can give us examples of some of these even ephemeral objects that have existed for generations. And this is something our new colleague Mudit Trivedi has been working on in India, as well as looking at how do we see through ephemeral objects like glass bangles and things like this. How do we know who the people who lived in these places were? What do we understand about their engagements with these objects? And so even disposable objects, I think, provide lingering traces that help us to understand their material context. As to the issue of what's happening in the age of Zoom, et cetera, it varies a lot, and all of the prayer apps and things like this. I mean, there's certainly plenty of people who would argue that the virtual world is still a material world, that virtuality is not absent of materiality, that they're very much shaped by either concepts of ideal bodily comportment, of particular affective and somatic responses to prayers or to pilgrimage experiences that one could have through all of these different media, there's still a strong materiality here. So I personally would not characterize it as a loss of materiality. It's a materiality that's being relocated and perhaps reactivated through different vectors that provide, in some ways, more opportunities, as we see here, for people to interact in the COVID world. Yeah. It's actually very interesting to think in those terms about what material possibilities exist within a virtual life. In fact, there are ways in which virtual assemblages of Muslim communities have really provided space for certain types of being Muslim that would typically find it difficult to live publicly. There are collective Jummahs, or gatherings of gay Muslims, of people who are living with particular gender, non-normative genders, et cetera, that are incredibly powerful and welcoming and create whole new experiential zones for Muslims that in the last 10, 15 years have actually expanded the possibilities for embodying Islam within one's own life, even if some of that is happening in a non immediately physical encounter. Mm-hmm. but it's a very interesting question to ponder, and I think it's also one of those watch this space kind of questions,
Right. Right.
because we don't have all the answers yet to how that may unfold.
Okay, now I'm going to ask two related questions again. Um, First, and I'm quoting someone here, I'm paraphrasing someone, I would like to hear from you about the circulation of things that allows things to have power and agency. Um, I would imagine that the circulation of the same Islamic things that you study would give these things different powers, meanings, and agency, depending on the cultures that they circulate within. And then the related question is this. You talked about the vitality and power of things within the Islamic tradition. Could you talk about whether and how the vitality and power of Islamic things could be cultivated in the West to counter colonial narratives about Muslims and Islam?
Okay, interesting. How the circulation of the same Islamic things become different in different cultures.
And I guess implied in that is that circulation itself is a kind of vector and produces power,
Yeah,
differentials
absolutely.
of power, right? Yeah.
Yeah. No. So from that perspective, one of the things that is very interesting. Again, it's interesting to consider something like prayer beads, which are extremely ubiquitous, and even in cultures that tend towards Salafi dispositions, particularly in the Gulf and the Middle East, where historically there's been a lot of debates around what the acceptability of the use of prayer beads. You see them everywhere. People use them all the time. So certainly they're not absent from those environments. But then with the question of what gives them power, like what might set one set of prayer beads apart from another, would be a question that a Salafi might answer to say nothing. These are simply means of enumerating prayer. There's no one set of prayer beads has any particular possibilities. It doesn't change the nature of one's prayer. But for others, this may be a set of prayer beads that's been passed down through their family, that was brought back from Hajj by a beloved neighbor, that they brought themselves to visit places of significance to them, that had helped them through times of stress and trouble, and that had been worn with their own hands in particular ways, thereby creating a very physical, a mnemonic attachment. That this is something that they have actually contributed in the making of, as the beads become smooth, as the thread becomes oiled through their own bodily interactions, that those actually change the quality and capacity of that object over time, giving it all kinds of significance, from the sentimental, and nostalgic, to the affective. I'm thinking here of Sarah Ahmed's idea of happy objects, right? Things that there's a kind of stickiness to the affects that are attached to things, and that what contributes to that sticking, what makes a particular set of feelings and ideas attached to that object, and allow it to move through different spaces, still holding on to those qualities. So I think that's a really productive way of thinking about those different orientations, and those sort of different ways of thinking about what an object can signify and come to signify through its use, its circulation, its repetition, and through iteration. So you see, I think one of my favorite things about Richard McGregor's chapter on the sandal prints of the Prophet Muhammad that I showed a slide from. He has about 12 images in that chapter that on a certain level are indistinguishable. They're all roughly the same shape, but there's so much variation within each that signify the particularities of the creator, and perhaps speak to the places it was intended to circulate. Of course, we can see variations in patronage and craft that would distinguish the same object. A tasbih, a prayer bead, could be extremely simple. It could be extremely elaborate in the way that it's, you could have it made out of precious gems or out of extremely humble wood. Or you often find people also simply counting with seeds or beans or something like this as a means of enumeration. Or for Salafis, it may be marking the prayer on the fingers, on the digits of the fingers. So the common numbers being 99 or 100 circulations of prayers. They say this is why our hands are designed this way, because we can enumerate easily with our three-part fingers, phalanges. There's probably a good biological word for the three parts of our fingers. Yeah, so it's an interesting question, and now I've totally forgotten about the other one, which is about the West in some way.
Yes. How could let me go back to it. Hold on. I've got so many questions here. I can't keep them straight. How could the power and vitality of Islamic things be cultivated in the West to counter colonial narratives about Muslims and Islam?
Well, I mean, this is one of my hopes and fears, I suppose. As somebody who's worked in Islamic studies now for a long time, I'm always disheartened by things that have come to seem very obvious to me and my colleagues are still not part of a collective consciousness about the nature and diversity of Islam. And even to, all around us, we see examples of ways in which stereotypes and expectations about what it means to be Muslim are become operationalized in means of diminishing, repressing, marginalizing, and even justifying harming of Muslim people in both domestically and internationally. And so one of the things that I hope that projects like this can do is to make it less and less possible for such generalizations to have purchase. Obviously some of this is not necessarily CNN, and we're not talking to a wide cross-section of the public, but every time, yes, exactly. But every time I think me and colleagues and others try to complicate this story and to show the many creative and fascinating ways, and ways that we can look at a thinker like Ibn Arabi in the 13th century and still learn from his perspectives and put it into conversation with somebody like Jane Bennett, who a lot of people would think of as being a little too high theory to be relevant. It's not at all. I think these are really profoundly humanist, and being at the Humanities Center here, these are the job of humanists, is to help us understand each other better. And so, I mean, certainly that's a hope, but there's no guarantee.
Thank you. That was wonderful. And you anticipated something I was going to ask you, and now I think I won't. I was going to ask you about specifically how would you put Bennett in conversation with somebody, a 14th century figure like Ibn Arabi, but we can come back to that if we have time. I have so many questions from the audience that I want to get to a couple more before we run out of time. We only have about 10 minutes left. Again, paraphrasing a viewer, thank you for an insightful presentation and introduction to the book. You briefly touched on this, but I wonder if you found in your work an association of gender and power. By this, I mean whether objects associated with masculinity or heteronormativity are perhaps considered more Islamic, whether there is more or less reception in Islamic materiality, more or less reception to Islamic materiality based on gender, or finally, whether the objects themselves take on a gendered nature.
Yeah, so lots of levels to that fascinating question. And yes, in a way, to all of those. I'll start with the last first, because in a way it's the most straightforward. As probably the questioner knows, many of the languages that are current within Muslim majority cultures, and Arabic itself, of course, are gendered. And so every object does in fact have a gender in that sense. So in that regard, there is a deeply gendered understanding of things that is not necessarily also a hierarchical understanding. And so I think a lot of times when we talk about gender, we start verging into questions of authority and hierarchy, and whether or not women's or people who are gendered as female, their concepts or their practices maybe are less authoritative or are less, and that masculine and heteronormative concepts are more authoritative or more current. And this is challenging because it very much differs, I think, from context to context. On the one hand, shrine cultures that I study tend to be wide open to people of all and no genders on a wide spectrum of orientations, that they tend to be welcoming for anybody, and all religions as well, of course. But so that the idea that but there are certainly those who criticize that as being part of why this is superstitious, popular practice, or somehow less authentic. And so debates around what is authentically Muslim or authentic Islam are often do get worked out in gendered terms. And those are ongoing conversations. There's a lot of fantastic work in Islamic studies along these lines. It's less of an absolutely central concern in my work, but it's certainly not absent.
Mm-hmm.
The questions of gender and power are also excellent. Whether objects associated with femininity are greater or lesser power. There'd certainly be some who would argue that that the gendering of an object as feminine, and even from the perspective that requires it to be disciplined, controlled, and made to conform to particular models of behavior, is in fact a recognition of a form of power, and a sense that is something that requires discipline, and those practices that may also require a kind of discipline. Most of these, the spaces that I study are not or not always gender segregated. So there's some shrines where you would go that women are not allowed in contact with the tomb itself, for example. But within the other general environs, there's no barriers on interactions between men and women, between old and young, et cetera. And there's certainly no barrier to entry to the larger complexes in those senses. Certainly, this then gets us into debates around what constitutes power and authority. Is it only and always legible entirely through ownership and through a particular kind of externalized power structure, rather than through the dynamics by which women are often charged with the daily labor of maintaining the spiritual integrity of their families and communities, and that part of that caretaking process is enacted through their necessary religious labor. And so, as essential workers, if you will, in the economy of these spiritual spaces. So it is women who are often the experts in what to do and where to go and when. If you have this problem, where do you go and how do you interact with the site? It's women who often know what are the right places for particular concerns. If your child is sick, if your son has a horrible wife, what do you do? Where do you go? Who do you talk to? And that is knowledge that is often imparted orally. But it still has its own expertise. I think also Flukiger's chapter on the Muslim woman healer, Amma, she has an entire book on her as well. That's an excellent read if you have time. Deals with some of these issues, and I think really important in effective ways. What is the role of female power?
Let's have one more question, and it's I guess we take a step back out, and it's really a question about your field. Thank you so much for such a rich and dense overview of the importance of studying these everyday objects. Are studies of Islam within the Western Academy often forced to address Western stereotypes and/or Islamophobia? I guess you've partly addressed this, but there's more. intertwined with foundational historical intersections between Christianity and the articulation of liberal democracy. Do religious studies scholars writing within and for these Islamic cultures employ markedly different rhetoric or study other kinds of objects and practices, assuming already the rich network of senses and practices in Islamic cultures and societies? In other words, does the audience here in the West and its attitudes to Islam shape academic studies of Islam and the rhetoric one has to adopt? And do cross-cultural studies, for instance, in your case, across India and Turkey, do other kinds of work or serve as a model for something, something more capacious?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really thoughtful question, thought-provoking question. It's so within Islamic studies context, when nobody needs to be told about the diversity of Islam and the diversity of these cultures, and it doesn't take on the same necessity of changing people's minds that Muslims are people too, for example, that I think we often as public intellectuals feel like we have to continually assert those claims. But there remains extremely divisive debates within Islamic studies around what constitutes the field that, ebb and flow and blow up on social media, et cetera, from time to time, get worked out, of course, in scholarly works as well, about things like, say, the status of Arabic and whether knowing and reading and working in Arabic sources is essential to be a scholar of Islam or in any substantive way. And for many, increasingly, this kind of question is part of that kind of those hegemonic expectations of what Islam is, that is rooted in this very male heteronormative 7th century Arab context that does not allow for the voices of women and subalterns of various confirmations to have space and to be considered as theorizing their Islam, to be thought of as enacting and inhabiting an authoritative or authentic Muslim world. And so those debates very much do persist within the field. And I think myself and many of my colleagues are really adamant that if we're dismissing scholars like Suad Abdul Kabir, who wrote an amazing book called Muslim Cool on dress and fashion and ways of Black Muslim masculinity in particular and humanity, which is not devoid of the authoritative discourses of text in Arabic, et cetera. There are certainly people who would say that this is not the same level of scholarship as somebody who's doing a deep read of the Quran and Hadith and working through Islamic law. That's the real heavy hitting. That's where Islamic studies is still rooted in this kind of Orientalist heritage that it emerged from. This, which of course, in that sense, as I'm sure the questioner knows better than I, evokes all these ideas that are bound up within the colonial project of why are we trying to gather particular types of knowledge, and why are we reifying those types of knowledge about Muslim communities and cultures and populations as being more or less Muslim. Essentially this puts the academic in the place of determining what is authentically Muslim, which is a form of sort of intellectual violence in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I know we're out of time, but that's certainly, it's a big question, I think, and one that I think places some of this into conversation with a bigger internal debate within my field.
Yeah. We are out of time, but I want to thank you, Anna, because this is, we have only scratched the surface and we have so many questions from the audience. We could easily go another half hour. What I would suggest is that when your monograph appears, we have another series here at the Humanities Center called Inside the Center, in which we invite someone whose book is just about to appear or has just appeared to talk about that book, we would love to have you back to do this again. We can notify all the people who reserved for this that you'll be back again if you want to do it. And we can, continue the conversation now with the next stage of your work in front of us. That would be great for us. We hope you'd be able to do that in the near future.
I appreciate it. That'd be great. It's a great motivation to get it done too.
But I really want to thank you, because every one of these answers has enriched the questions. And to me, this is a kind of a model for what we want a Q&A in this kind of event to be. So thank you so much. And to those of you in the audience, I just want to invite you to join us next month, December 10th, also at 11 a.m. Pacific time, for a book talk of the kind I just mentioned with Niloufar Hayeri as part of the series I mentioned, our series Inside the Center. Hayeri, who is a professor of anthropology at Johns Hopkins University, was a fellow at the Stanford Humanities Center in 2015-16, and she will be discussing her new book, Say What Your Longing Heart Desires: Women, Prayer, and Poetry in Iran. We look forward to welcoming her back to the center, even though on this occasion it has to be online. So Anna Bigelow, thank you so much. Our audience, thank you so much for your great questions. As always, more information about what we're presenting can be found on our website, shc.stanford.edu. Until next time.